Our next bracket is devoted to demography. It will be led by Bernard Salt, with two discussants, Professor Helen James and Geoff Pollard, in a question and discussion series like we just had, chaired by Joe, but this time chaired by Julie Bishop. Bernard Salt is well known, I think, to most people in this room through his publications. He is, as you'll see, a partner with KPMG, but he's well known as author of The Big Picture, Beyond the Baby Boomers, and other publications where he has used analytical tools to define a number of the mega trends in demography. So Bernard's going to talk for about 20 minutes, then we'll go to our discussants, and then a question and discussion session. Thank you, Bernard.
Thanks very much, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you also to the Menzies Centre for the invitation to speak. Bernard Salt, I'm a partner with KPMG based in Melbourne. My presentation today, Demographic Trends Shaping the Australian Community in the 2010s. How do you connect with, how do you sell products to, how do you sell votes, if you like, to the Australian community in the 2010s? I want to start by looking at the way we live our lifestyles, or different lifestyles, different life cycles that have evolved. And I want to start this by going back 80 years to look at life expectancy in Australia in 1930. In 1930, the average Australian lived for 63 years. You qualified for the age pension at 65, so you promptly dropped dead 2 years before you got a pension back in 1930. The other thing to note is that in 1930, you're a child for 14 years and then you're an adult. The life form we now know as a teenager did not exist in 1930. Childhood, adulthood, old age and death. That's the way it worked 80 years ago. And you're an old person at 51 or 52. When you get home tonight, get out your family photograph albums, have a look at pictures of your grandparents at the age of 50. They were old people. They looked old, they dressed old, they knew they had about 10 years to go. Let's kick it forward another 40 years to 1970. Life expectancy for the average Aussie has kicked out to 71 years. That is 6 years in retirement. It has to be planned for, provision for, either by the individual or by the state. The other thing that's happened by 1970 is that the baby boomers have come along and invented a transition phase between childhood and adulthood called the teenage phase in life. And now you're not an old person until well into your 60s. Let's kick that forward another 40 years to 2010, and life expectancy for the average Aussie has kicked out to 82 years, 83 for women and 79 for men. That is 17 years in retirement that has to be planned for, provision for. Although the most common age at retirement for an Australian is not 65, it's 58. That's 24 years in retirement. Statistically, if you make it through to 58, you've got more than 24 years, you've got about 27 years in retirement. Let's just say the last couple of years ain't so hot. You've got about 20 healthy, active years of life that has been gifted to this generation. What are you going to do? Sit at home and babysit the grandkids? Or are you going to re-engineer that space? And that re-engineering, I say, begins in the coming decade as baby boomers push into their 50s. The other shift, of course, that has occurred over the last decade has been driven by Gen X and Gen Y, who've picked up the teenage phase in life invented by the baby boomers. They've picked it up and they've stretched it. I think you're now a teenager between the ages of 13 and 29. All the traditional measures of the transition into adulthood, the baby boomers are making at 21, 22, 23, commitment to marriage, mortgage, children and a career, has been kicked out by Gen X and now by Gen Y to 28, 29 or 30. That changes the use of discretionary time and spending in the 20-something time in life. You don't need to be in a 3-bedroom brick veneer on the edge of town. You want to be in an inner-city apartment where you form, dismantle and reform relationships. Look at what's popular on television: Out with Neighbours, In with Friends, Seinfeld, Sex and the City. No one's married, no one has kids. These are tribal relationships: form, dismantle, reform relationships. Or you live at home with your parents who are in their 50s, you're in your 20s. They're known as kippers, K-I-P-P-E-R-S, kids in parents' pockets, eroding retirement savings. And of course, it has created an entire culture, a different way of thinking. There is a new narrative that has emerged to describe the average Australian lifestyle in their 20s. The other shift, of course, that has occurred over the last decade has been driven by baby boomers who've also picked up the teenage phase of life. They've picked it up and they've reinserted it into the 50-something time in life as a new teenage phase. Baby boomers invented a transition into adulthood 40 years ago, and now they're inventing a transition into retirement. Sea change, tree change, come out of left field over the last decade. Traditional retirement's still there, 65 to 74. This is the grey nomad phase in life, the Winnebago phase in life. And then 75 and beyond is the frail elderly. Although in speaking to the assisted care industry, they told me that the kick-in is not 75, it's 78. It is literally 20 years of life, 58 to 78, that I think is going to be rewritten, re-engineered. And I think the opportunity in business and in politics is to actually understand that narrative, to actually connect with baby boomers who do not see themselves as old. Never describe a baby boomer as retired. Old people are retired, their parents retired, obsolete people are retired. They'll never retire, but they'll do a bit of a sea change, a tree change. A new concept coming out of California is the portfolio lifestyle stage in the life cycle. Work 2 days a week, play golf 1 day of the week, do some volunteering on another day of the week, do something with your spouse, invest in your relationship. It's a bit of this, a bit of that. It's simply a better business model than the 20th century notion of working to the age of 65, getting a gold watch and retiring. Then, of course, the notion of retiring at 55. If you don't start work until 28 or 29 and you intend living through to 82, 3, 84, 85, there is simply not enough productive tax-paying years to fund the life cycle we are now expecting beyond the age of 55. I can actually see the working life extending beyond 55, beyond 60, perhaps even beyond 70, but it will be done differently. The blurring and blending of work with lifestyle. And I think that's the major shift we will see with the baby boomers over the coming decade. In the next chart, I actually wanted to identify the fastest growing tribes in Australia, and by tribes I mean non-Australian born populations. And this is a list of the top 5 fastest growing tribes in Australia over the last decade. These are permanent residents or people who are in Australia for at least 12 months or more. Heading this list, of course, is the Chinese and the Indians. This is the new frontier. This is the new ethnic impact on the Australian market, if you like. And they sit on an Anglo base, South Africans and Kiwis. This is very different to the 20th century where we had Mediterranean influence, Greeks and Italians. When the Greeks and the Italians arrived here in the 1950s, we regarded their food as wog food, and we said as much. By the 1980s, we realised actually your food is better than our food, and by the 1990s, we started to emulate their lifestyle, eating out on the pavement as they do the piazza, the plaza. The issue is not in terms of connecting with the new tribes. The issue is the way in which the new tribes impact by osmosis Middle Australian values. At my local suburb in middle suburbs of Melbourne, in 1996, there was a makeover of the local Woolworths store. When I went into it, they had made over the fruit and veggie department, and there was an entire bay devoted to bok choy. This was within 10 years of the Vietnamese arriving in Australia. So it's the impact that the new tribes have on Australian value. Cafes, bars, restaurants. We drink coffee, not tea, although the Asian influence now would suggest this might shift back. Indians and Chinese drink tea. Kiwis and South Africans play rugby, not soccer or AFL. These are the influences that I would see in Australia going forward. The demographics going backwards. Of course, the poor old Italians arrived here in the 1950s. 60 years later, they're dying off. This is a receding of Mediterranean values and an advance of Asian values. Not necessarily of the tribes themselves, but of their capacity to impact the centre of gravity of Middle Australian thinking. That's the challenge. That's the opportunity in the next decade. In the next slide, I'm often asked to talk about trends over the next 10 years, and my argument is always the same. You should never look forward 10 years until you have first looked back 10 years. And I've done that in this chart for Australia between 2000 and 2010. Australia added 3 million people over that time frame. Here is how those net extra 3 million people fell across the age profiles. You can see in the 0 to 4 demographic, the baby blip, the baby bonus, produced about 150,000 more kids on the Australian continent now than in the year 2000. So baby paraphernalia, the baby issue, absolutely came to the fore in the last decade. The big shift in the 20s, of course, the studentification of the Australian continent. There's around about 600,000 overseas students on the Australian continent now that more or less did not exist in the year 2000. So cafes, bars, restaurants, technology, inner city living. Is that not the story of our major cities over the last decade? The real shift, of course, is up there in the 50s, 55 through to 65. This is the ageing of the baby boomers. And of course, when you have that number of people pumping into that phase in life, you have premiumisation. You're at the peak of your income earning capacity. Investment property, superannuation, financial services, sea change, tree change, the issue of their children, Generation Y. You can start to see the way in which the culture of a community is changed over a decade by reading the demographics. All very interesting, of course, but that was last decade. What about the coming decade? The next chart shows you where the 3.3 million people will be added to the Australian continent over the next decade. And I think it has profound impact, profound lessons for the shaping of Australia. The baby blip, if you like, over the last decade converts into more primary schools students, 5 to 10. So issues around schools will become critical over the coming decade. The 20-somethings morph into 30-somethings, out of students into household formation. Housing affordability has got to be right down the line. This is Gen Y, finding their feet, finding they can't afford a house in big numbers will start to dominate the middle part of this decade. And then, of course, the baby boomers moving from their 50s and 60s into their late 60s and 70s. This is not old people, it's not retirement home, this is early active retirement. This is sea change, this is tree change, this is downshifting. Sell your house in Hornsby that you bought in 1975 for $40,000 that's now worth $1.8 million unencumbered. Sell that, buy a property down at Mollymook for $700,000, top up your super, live happily ever after. Downshifting. But if you look at this demographic, the next decade, I think, is going to be dominated by the 30-somethings and the late 60s and early 70s. Those two times in life are driven by value, affordability. Whereas what drove the last decade, people in their 20s, high levels of discretionary spending, and people in their 50s at the peak of their income earning capacity, is about premiumisation. From premiumisation to affordability, I think, will be the shift over the coming decade. In the next slide, I wanted to show you just the scale of what we can expect in the next decade or so. This chart shows you the number of people added to the Australian continent over 100 years, 1950 on the left, 2050 on the right. But it's the total population added to the 65-plus bucket. 65, this is the amount of people added to the bucket that has their hand out, if you like, for an age pension and pharmaceutical benefit schemes, a whole range of other stuff. If you look back over the last 60 years, from 1950 through to 2010, through our lifetime, through our careers, that number has increased by around 20, 30, 40,000 people per year, extra tipping across that line. Let's have a look at the next 40 years. And of course, this changes the demographic. This is the ageing of the baby boomer generation. This baby boomer generation will be the first generation in retirement that are educated, opinionated and articulate, and very easily organised, opinionated, and of course very difficult people to deal with, and taking on causes, if you like, and particularly taking on a cause. You know, they're leisure, they've got nothing else to do, you're a retired school teacher, you rally around and you make a politician's life hell, or a local council officer's hell, or a local corporation or a multinational corporation. You're there with a cause, and I think managing those expectations will be one of the great challenges in the coming decade. I want to look at exactly the same perspective, 100 years, but I want to look at the Australian working age population. In this chart I show you the number of people added to the Australian population every year, again for 100 years, 1950 on the left, 2050 on the right, and the numbers of course go up to 2010. But this is not the total population added to Australia. This is the population added to the 15 to 64 demographic. 15 to 64-year-olds buy consumer goods, they take out loans, they reproduce and they pay tax. This is the gut, the engine, the piston that drives the Australian economy. And do we not agree that over the course of the last 50, 60 years, the number of people added to that number has increased by around about 150, 200,000 people per year. Do that long enough for 60 years and I think your economy starts to gear around that. 200,000 extra people per year into the household formation stage in the life cycle. Well, housing industry responds. Is not the Australian economy geared around housing, construction, finance, furnishing, inhabiting? So you would actually see, what about the tax base? You've suddenly got more people every year for 60 consecutive years growing by 150 to 200,000 people. We are at a crossroads. We can either take the pathway to big Australia or to small Australia. Currently we have 22 million people on the Australian continent. Those who argue for a small Australia say, let's cut back overseas migration to 70,000 people per year. This number, I might add, averages 100,000 migrants, overseas migrants per year. What does the world look like for Australia in terms of growth to the working age population, the skills base, the labour pool that we will run the economy? What does it look like at 70,000 migrants per year? I see a problem. I see a problem in 2011. Why 2011? Because the first baby boomer born in 1946 turned 65 in 2011. And all of a sudden you've got more baby boomers exiting the workforce than Gen Ys entering the workforce. For the last 60 years, 50 years, everyone in this room built their careers, built their businesses, if you like, on the logic of more people pumping into the workforce, more consumers, more taxpayers, more people forming households, if you like. And then, of course, it all drops. And precisely at this time, we're saying, well, let's wind back overseas migration to 70,000 people per year. Well, the number of people that actually net through in terms of the working age population reduces to less than 50,000. I think the economy would go through convulsions if for 60 years it's been used to this rate of growth and then it's dropped to 70,000. It would also have an impact on, surely, the tax base. If you've got more people exiting the workforce than entering the workforce, surely that has an impact on the tax base going forward. Politicians have enough problems allocating a rising tax base. How do you think they would go allocating a contracting or a static tax base? This is a really big issue for Australia. And in fact, it was such a big issue that the demographers advising the Australian Bureau of Statistics about the future for this country in September 2008, 1 year before Kevin Rudd made his Big Australia statement, issued a forecast for this country based on 180,000 migrants per year to offset the impact of the baby bust. That's what this is. It's a baby bust, it's a fault line, if you like. And here's the 180,000 migrants per year. And all it does is to simply continue the rate of growth that we've experienced previously. The problem is this. Baby boomers born in the late 1940s went into the workforce in the middle of the 1960s. For 25 years they paid tax to the governments of the day. And those governments of the day spent that tax on education, health, defence, whatever it is, but not on a national savings scheme, retirement scheme. That was always to be covered by the taxpayers of the day. Well, that day has now arrived. Generation X and Generation Y have been paying into the superannuation guarantee from 1992 are more or less largely self-sufficient in retirement from the late 2020s into the 2030s. We have a short-term problem. That problem starts in 2011, goes through about 27, 28. That is where I think we need to offset this baby boomer bust, if you like, by increasing the level of overseas migration and managing the issues around that. I understand it's a very sensitive issue, but I think it's absolutely a compelling demographic case to manage the issues associated not with the rate of growth we've had over the last 3 years, but with an elevated rate of growth of 180,000 migrants per year. What does it look like if you don't address this issue? I want to show you this same chart for another country, one of our leading trading partners. Same concept, 1950, 2050. Here are the same figures. Net growth in the working age population over 100 years for Japan. This is a country that collapsed its birth rate in the 1960s, and that does not do immigration. When did Japan peak? Probably about 1989, 90. When did it go into the malaise? Probably about the mid-1990s. All of a sudden, you've got more people exiting the workforce than entering the workforce. I think that this would be an almost impossible position to manage politically. How many Prime Ministers has Japan had this decade? 8. I think that these are big issues. I don't see Australia following the trajectory of Japan, but of course it shows what happens when you don't address the underlying demographic issues which feed into the worker pool, which feed into the tax base, to which we have all become addicted in terms of our lifestyle. Now, my solution is you either ask Generation X and Generation Y to pay more tax per capita, or you increase the per capitas. And that is the argument behind an elevated rate of growth of 180,000 migrants per year. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard. I'm going to introduce both our discussants at once, and before I ask the first Helen James to speak. They have two things in common. Demography and tennis, and I'd like some explanation as to why they're linked. Helen is a specialist in mainland Southeast Asia with a very distinguished academic career and background. Her specialty is in researching civil society, governance, health, education and policy alleviation and development economics in the Southeast Asian region. Geoff Pollard is a statistician, most recently senior lecturer in statistics at Macquarie University. The tennis. Geoff, of course, is well known to everyone, I think, from running the Australian Open and for his substantial contribution to tennis. Helen's is a much more specific Menzies Research Centre interest in tennis. She used to be the tennis partner of Julian's distinguished predecessor, Michael L'Estrange, who was the first executive director of the Menzies Research Centre. So it's all highly relevant. Helen.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for this great honour to be able to address this distinguished audience this morning. I'm not actually commenting on Bernard's paper. I'm taking it probably a little bit further and looking at the Asian region in terms of some of the demographic and critical issues which I think Australia will probably focus on in the next 10, 20, 30 years. First, I've looked at 5 because of the time limitations on this talk. Human resource development, the ageing population issue that we've already heard of, access to material, financial and psychosocial resources, that's the resources question, responses to specific environmental contexts, and issues of continuing multiculturalism, internationalism and cooperation. And I've chosen those because in the Asian region, our neighbours, and I'll show you soon, have for 30 years or more, those countries which have developed, particularly the ones we call the Asian Tigers, have had a critical focus on their human resource development, on education and health and so on, because they've been very, very conscious that that was the West's path to growth. And so they've invested hugely in their educational institutions, and that in turn provided them with the base for their economic development, as we saw in South Korea and Taiwan, Singapore, and so on. The ageing population issue is very real to the region, as I'll show you in a few minutes with another slide. It's most critical in the 6 very high human development countries, but it is also taking place in what we call the medium development countries, and there are 10 of those. This has specific implications for the markets in the region, for educational, continuing educational development and so on. Access to material, financial and psychosocial resources. I'm particularly conscious here of countries like India and China, where their continuing access to resources of all those kinds will, I think, be a fundamental issue in maintaining peace in the region and Australia's continued peaceful interaction. As far as I can see, the critical issue for China, in fact what we might call a dangerous issue for Australia, would be if China and then India in turn could not get access to the resources they require to sustain their continued evolution of the well-being of their huge populations. It's not just in the democratic countries or the non-democratic countries, but all the governments across the region know, and we can see this happening in the Middle East, of course, at the present time, that they're really only in power as long as they can continue to hold out to their population base the prospect of a better life, particularly for parents in some of these countries that went through the Cultural Revolution in China and so on. Their major objective in life is to be able to provide a better future for their children. And that, of course, requires huge investment. Australia, as we know from the talks this morning, etc., is in a very envious position to be able to provide a large amount of those resources, both the minerals resources, but also access to our educational institutions, and I hope that would continue. China, we're very conscious, I think, has many tentacles out in other parts of the world, in Africa, South America, so to try to maintain that access to the resources that it requires for its future development. And that's an issue that I think we need to keep in focus also. Responses of the regional countries to changing environmental contexts. All around the Asian region, this is the part of the world which suffers the greatest impact from things like typhoons, earthquakes, cyclones, floods, etc. Tsunami, although momentous, was in fact, not a frequent event, but the Philippines, for example, is that country in the region which has the greatest number of these natural disasters. And the Asian region, of course, also has a large number of megacities where populations, their own populations, are migrating from rural areas to the city. Migration is actually, international migration for these countries is actually fairly small, it's fairly minuscule compared to the internal migration that is going on. Those megacities could very well be impacted quite severely by the continuing evanescence of large-scale typhoons and cyclones. And this might, in future, lead to further and enhanced desires of some of those currently city-based populations to migrate to other countries around the world, including Australia. In the Asian region, there's currently some 80 million people who are engaged in internal and external migration. And that's 80 million out of some 200 million around the world. So it's not an insignificant issue. And finally, the fifth critical issue, I think, is multiculturalism, internationalism and cooperation. I would hope that Australia would continue to maintain this focus, because I think that history has shown us that those societies which retreat into themselves in turn very quickly atrophy and are unable to sustain the well-being of their populations. I take as just a quick example the historical cycles of China's rise and retreats. When we had the three major dynasties, like the Han, the Sung, the Ming, These were cycles of wonderful outward interactions, trade interactions, cultural interactions, with all other areas of the established world as they were at the time. And when China retreated, then other parts of the world in turn found that their own well-being was impacted. So take the Sung, for example, in the 12th century. It coincided with a wonderful efflorescence of art and culture and architecture in Western Europe in the 12th century. And when the cycles in China changed, so the economic cycles in Western Europe also retreated. Now, let me go to the next one. Just taking comparative human development in some of these countries, of the 193 countries in the world addressed by the Human Development Reports, 6 of them in the Asian region are listed as either very high human development or high human development. The numbers in brackets indicate their HDI ranking. 10 are in the medium human development, and you'll see that this includes China and India. And then, of course, there's the low ones, Timor-Leste and North Korea, for which we have insufficient data. Looking a little bit more closely at what this means, the GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, US dollars per person, in the high to very high human development countries ranges from a low of $13,500 per year, that's Malaysia, to $50,200 per year in Brunei. Not Japan, but Brunei. The medium human development countries range from $900 or thereabouts, that's Myanmar, to 81.3, which is Thailand. Again, this is sorry, I beg your pardon, 88.1 thousand, that's Thailand. So China and India are actually fairly far down the list. China's around $5,000 per year per person, and India around the $3,000 mark. I won't go through all of these, just to show you that the poverty index then is fairly well coinciding with things like education, adult literacy, and in turn life expectancy at birth. So education in the high development countries at 71.5% of gross enrolment ratios, and again that's Malaysia, up to 98.5% in Japan, might be what you would expect, because again that's the high economy growth countries. In the medium countries, you have a gross enrolment ratio of 52.1 in Bangladesh, rising to 79.6 in Thailand. So there's still a lot of disparity. And education provides the access to employment, to a better quality of life for the people in these medium development countries. Adult literacy rates also follow this pattern and run fairly consistently. Where there's a high adult literacy rate, then it coincides with a high human development, and conversely. The life expectancy at birth, similarly. Children underweight for age, I take this because it's a proxy for health, and health, as we know, is considered a good, fairly robust measure of the efficacy of governance. And so where health and health outcomes are precarious, then in turn you can expect that the governance in that society needs improvement. Children underweight for age under 5 range from 3, which is in Singapore, 3%, to 8 in Malaysia, but in the medium development countries there's 7, which is around Thailand, to 48% in Bangladesh. That's a very high percentage of children under 5, and in turn, as you might expect, there are issues of poor nutrition and poor housing. So all the socioeconomic indicators really go together. Similarly, the last one, the gender index rank, also consistently parallel that pattern of development. I wanted to just take you to a couple of the slides dealing with some details of one of these medium development countries. And without going through it in a great deal of detail, you'll see that this country, Myanmar, which is very poor in most of the socioeconomic indicators, very poor in governance and health incomes, still has not made any of the transitions, health transition or demographic transition, that you might expect from the other medium development countries. Myanmar has... Yes, please.